So what a privilege it is to introduce my old friend, Andy Chaikin. Oh my gosh, we were thinking like 8 or 10 years since we've seen each other, something like that. Andy's no stranger to this meeting. I'll mention why in just a second. Andy is a science journalist and a space historian, and he's pretty much acknowledged by most everyone as the world's foremost authority on Apollo history. He's author of A Man on the Moon, which was turned into Tom Hanks' 12-part HBO miniseries From Earth to the Moon. That was what introduced me to Lee Silver. And I'll mention Lee in just a second in another context. So the astronaut, the last man to touch the lunar surface, Gene Cernan, said after reading his book, "I've been there, Andy took me back." So is that a wow or what? He's the former editor of Sky and Telescope, which is kind of how I first knew his name. He's been a commentator on all sorts of different news programs related to our common interest here. Like I say, this is not Andy's first NESF. And back then we called it the Lunar Science Forum. And he chaired a session that's one of my greatest memories of this whole institute back in 2009. And I remember Dave Morrison, who was founding director of our institute, and I had thought, how are we going to celebrate the 40th anniversary? We're not going to be able to get an Apollo 11 astronaut here. They will have been booked for 5 years, right? But we thought, we're a science institute. Let's get the scientists. And so we did. We got some of the ALSEP investigators and some others, a lot of whom are sadly no longer with us, but they were back then. One of those was Lee Silver, and I'll never forget, his talking about his experiences training the Apollo astronauts, and he got all choked up like I'm about to do. But anyway, Andy, it's just so great to have you here. And Andy is going to take a look forward at Artemis from his vast knowledge of Apollo and give us a little point of view that I think we're all going to enjoy. So, Andy, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg. It is so cool to be here. It's so cool to see people in 3 dimensions. I think like I had not gotten on an airplane until May since the pandemic, and it's just really been quite a good thing for my general well-being to be back amongst you all. And what a treat it is to be part of this and to get a sense of the incredible brain power in the room and the energy and the passion, which has always been there. But, if you're not in it every day, you kind of forget what that feels like. And it just feels wonderful to be back here. So thank you, Greg, for inviting me. And yeah, 2009, feels like a long time ago. I'm actually going to look back as much as I am look ahead, but I'm going to try and do both. I'm going to try and look in both directions at once, which is physically impossible. But, I guess I can do it metaphorically. So in case you haven't looked at the calendar, but I know you have, today is July 20th. So how cool is that? So, at this very moment, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were inside the lunar module Eagle over the far side of the moon, coming around towards the near side where they would ignite their lander's descent engine and begin the powered descent, about a 12 and a half minute process of getting from 50,000 feet above the lunar surface down to the surface itself. And what a time that was. And I will never forget it because, like all the Apollo missions, I was absolutely glued to the TV. But of course, the landing was, for most of us in the public, just the scene setter to the main event. And the main event happened that night. And it was a little bit before 11 p.m. Eastern time that Neil climbed down the front ladder of Eagle and set foot on the moon with a TV camera recording his movements. And then Buzz joined him about half an hour later. And the two of them set about exploring the Sea of Tranquility Base. And the TV pictures were dreamlike. There was something about those black and white images. They didn't have the big S-band antenna that they had planned on, so there was a little bit of a kind of ghostly quality of the image. It just seemed to fit. And I felt that way even more in retrospect as, I was 13 years old at the time. And when I would see those tapes again, the first time I saw them again really was 10 years later at the Air and Space Museum. It just seemed to become this magical stage play, Neil and Buzz like snowmen brought to life in those white suits bouncing around on an acre of moonscape. And, but this is what it looked like on the old black and white Zenith in my parents' bedroom as I was watching it. And it was just, how could you not be transfixed by that? And of course, as a 13-year-old, I didn't fully comprehend everything that was going on. I had tried to make myself a vicarious participant in this adventure, but there's only so much you can do when you're 13. And so, time went by and I became an Apollo historian, and I delved into this moonwalk like all the others in great detail. And how thrilling it was when LRO came along and was able to show us with a kind of a God's eye view of what had happened that magical Sunday night 54 years ago. This image is a crop from an LRO image of the landing site, and you can see the descent stage of Eagle on the left. You can see the experiments the astronauts left behind, and you can even see their tracks in the lunar dust. And you see a horizontal line where Neil took it upon himself to do something that was not in the script. This was definitely an off-script moment. He decided to run back to an 80-foot diameter crater that was about 200 and some odd feet behind the LEM to photograph it. He had seen it flying over it in the last moments of the descent, and he wanted to at least get over to the edge of the crater and see if there might be some exposed lunar bedrock. He knew the geologists would love that. So he ran back there by himself while Buzz was getting ready to hammer a core tube, and he took the panoramic view that you see on the bottom. But how amazing is it, that we can actually retrace Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's footsteps through the magic of LRO. I shouldn't call it magic because it's just phenomenal engineering. Well, that was 54 years ago, July 20th, and it was, people don't necessarily realize this. I know you all do, but people don't, in the wider world, don't realize how brief this incredible era of exploration was, that it was just 3.5 years later that Apollo's final moonwalk was taking place on the slopes of the North Massif in Taurus Littrow. This amazing adventure that had begun at Tranquility Base was now about to wrap up, but with a spectacular leap in capability, right? Because Gene Cernan and Jack Schmitt were one of 3 crews to take advantage of a battery-powered lunar rover that let them drive miles across the surface, even up the sides of towering lunar mountains, and to not to visit the moon, but to live on the moon for 3 days. And, to add to the growing trove of geologic treasure, which would captivate scientists for generations to come. So this is just one of those samples, okay? One of the 842 pounds that were brought back on the Apollo missions. This is the Genesis rock, so named, from Apollo 15. It's sitting atop a pedestal of gray dust, but you can see within that kind of grimy exterior, the lines of white, which would turn out to be a pure anorthosite, a chunk of the moon's primordial crust, something that they suspected was there, that Dave Scott and Jim Irwin had been trained to look for and know might be there. And there it was, presented to them on a pedestal, no less. What an incredible moment that was to witness. And if you haven't watched that tape in a long while, go back and look at Jim and Dave at Spur Crater and see what two test pilots who have been trained as lunar field geologists could do, right? You know, I have the title there, Rosetta Stones. Are they Rosetta Stones? You bet they are, because they represent what the moon can tell us that no other body in the solar system can. It can decode for us the earliest chapter in solar system history more cleanly than any other solar system body. It's one of the great gifts that Apollo gave us. Here's another one of the great gifts that Apollo gave us, a leap in awareness, the transformational view of home as a breathtakingly beautiful oasis in space, to use Jim Lovell's phrase from Apollo 8, that has inspired us and generations to see our planet as a priceless home planet that we have to cherish and protect. And one more gift. This is just some of the 400,000 people who worked on the Apollo spacecraft and boosters, and they're the ones that made it possible for us to leave our home planet, land on another world, and they did it on a deadline. Incredible. But that spirit of Apollo that motivated them still stands as an inspiration for anyone who would try to do, as John Kennedy said, things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And that's what Apollo was all about. It was about reaching down and pulling out the best in us to show the world what a free society was capable of in the context of the Cold War. But today, in a way that I hope transcends boundaries, transcends tribal divisions, Apollo is an inspiration to us that anything that seems impossible, many of those things can actually be accomplished when we work together, and we do it with the mindset that they had in Apollo. And of course, they allowed us to go far beyond Kennedy's mission statement with those beautiful rover missions that really amounted to the first full-up scientific expeditions on another world. Now, that was a long time ago, right? I mean, it's not only is it 54 years since the first human footsteps on the moon, but it's 51 years almost since the last human footsteps on the moon. And it just underscores the irony. Gene Cernan once said that Kennedy reached into the 21st century and grabbed a decade out of the 21st century and spliced it into the 60s, the 1960s and 70s. Well, here we are in the 21st century, and we have not seen Apollo. We've not picked up where Apollo left off with human beings. We, of course, have these incredible, magnificent machines that have transformed our understanding of the moon and have helped us understand the Apollo samples in ways that we couldn't have before. And of course, we need those machines. It's always been a partnership. Even in Apollo, it was a partnership between robots and humans. We would never have known where to land on the moon without those beautiful lunar orbiter missions that gave us the first high-resolution photographic maps of not only the near side, but the far side, and the surveyor landers that told us what the fine-scale surface of the moon would be like and whether it was safe for astronauts to land there, despite what Tommy Gold was telling people. But that was so long ago. And, you know, I want to share a story with you that I heard from Max Vauger, the great spacecraft designer, one of the true giants of Apollo. He told me this story back in around 2001, 2002 or so. He told me that one day in the 1970s, after Apollo had already ended, he and his former boss, Bob Gilruth, who was one of the giants of Apollo, they were walking on the beach in Galveston, Texas. And there was a big, beautiful moon in the sky. And they just stood there for a while looking at it. And Gilruth finally turned to Vauger and he said, you know, Max, Someday people are going to try to go back to the moon, and they're going to find out how hard it really is. And, in one sense, you can think about that from the standpoint of the technical burdens, the technical hurdles that even today are daunting, right? I mean, there's no tool and tooling for the building a Saturn V today. You couldn't do it. All of the things that they did to build those boosters and spacecraft and make them work, a lot of it was never written down, right? It was in the heads of the people who did it. And that corporate knowledge is mostly gone now. I mean, thank God we have the oral histories, we have the documentation that we do have. We've been able to preserve a tremendous amount of that. But there's another way to take Gilruth's comment too, which is it's so hard to get everybody marching in the same direction with the moon as the goal, the way we did during Apollo. And the only reason we went, lest we forget, John Kennedy did not wake up one morning and say, by God, we're a nation of explorers and the moon is out there and let's go. No, he woke up one morning and his advisors told him that Yuri Gagarin had beaten us into space. And so Kennedy was desperate for a way to win a battle in the Cold War using space, and the moon was a beautiful goal. It galvanized everybody. But, since Apollo, we've never been any closer to the moon than this photograph, this very beautiful photograph from the ISS. And so I've seen these photographs over the years. I've spent most of my adult life talking about what we got from Apollo, what it taught us about the moon, why we should go back. And, as time has gone on, year after year, I've felt the frustration, not only my frustration, but your frustration, that it is so hard to get out of low Earth orbit and get back to our nearest celestial neighbor. And Greg, you may even remember this next slide. I showed this next slide at that meeting in 2009. And I kind of ginned this up myself, and I think it pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? Charlie Brown and the football he never gets to kick. And that's kind of what it's felt like for anybody who has been a moon advocate. I used to call the moon the Rodney Dangerfield of the solar system. Some of you won't get that. Ask the older people sitting near you. But, again and again, and I can remember how many times I heard space advocates say, well, if we just had a president get up and make a speech, a really good speech, we'd be all set. Well, that happened in 1989 with George Bush Sr., and it happened in 2004 with George W. Bush. So, that's clearly not, it may be necessary, but it ain't sufficient. So I'm really happy to be here today at a time when the moon is finally getting the respect it deserves, and we finally are going to see humans go back to the moon and pick up where Apollo left off. We're finally going to hear human voices coming to us from places where no one has ever been. And then they're going to come back and tell us what it was like to stand on a world, the only world in the solar system where you can see the Earth as a planet, that breathtakingly beautiful oasis in all of its beauty. And we're going to go back to what I call the rare book room of the cosmic library. And we're going to start reading new pages from that earliest chapter of our solar system's history, right? The time of titanic collisions, right? The era after the infant Earth was formed from the solar nebula, when a Mars-sized body collided with that infant Earth and led to the formation of the moon. And then all of the impact history that is now recorded on the lunar surface. And in that history, we will read not only the story of the early solar system, but the story of how we came to be. So what an incredible gift that will be when we go back and we start picking up where Apollo left off. And I'm hopeful that before too long, we'll be able to do something that I never thought to do 54 years ago today or tonight, which is to go out and look at the moon and know that people are up there, living there, working there in the outward bound school for learning to live off planet. And even in time, perhaps, to take a backyard telescope and aim it at the South Pole and maybe see a tiny pinprick of light, which will be the first lunar base amid the shadows of the South Polar region. And to know that we are back on the journey that will eventually one day lead us out into the solar system to become a multi-planet species. And that will be worth the wait. Thank you.
Yeah, we can do. Yeah. Wonderful, Andy. I think that we all need to step back sometimes and get the big picture. You know, we who are the true believers even need that sometimes. So Andy has agreed. If anyone has any questions or points that they'd like to bring up, please go to the microphones, and we'll also take questions from anyone online. So go ahead, please.
I have two questions. One's a fun one, and then one is actually a data gathering one. So I'm Katie. I'm at the University of Maryland.
Just talk a little slower. 'Cause
Oh.
my 67-year-old ears are having trouble.
Not the first time I've heard that. So the fun question is, everyone has a favorite space history story, at least those who know a little bit of the backstory. Like my mom really likes the space sandwich. I personally like Michael Collins' advice to Neil Armstrong on first words on the moon. Did you have one? And what that story was? And then the other question was, now that we're going back to the moon, as a historian of science, what kind of oral histories, what kind of data would you like as a historian in today's effort, so that when the next generation of writers is looking back on Artemis, they have the exact right materials to work with when writing the history of Artemis?
Good question. Thank you. It's impossible for me to single out one story that's my favorite from all of the stories about Apollo, or even the subset of stories that I heard from the astronauts. Some of the ones that come back into my mind and have the most power are the ones where the astronauts talked about when the magnitude of the experience kind of broke through to them. You know, they're so they're so mission oriented. They have to be, right? And one of those stories was Alan Bean. He talked about the time during EVA-2 on Apollo 12 when he and Pete Conrad were running from one station stop to another. It was a long run. It was the first time that anybody really ran for a very long distance on the moon. I mean, Neil's run was a couple of 100 feet and back, but they were running for, you know, much longer than that. And Alan was running along, and the Earth from the Apollo 12 site was, you know, I don't know, halfway up the sky or more than that, I guess, actually. And he would look at the moon, look at the Earth, and he would think to himself, this is the moon. That is the Earth. I'm really here. And then in the next moment, he would say to himself, quit doing that. You got to look for rocks. So it's stories like that that I think of, or the one that Buzz told me, which is apropos of today being an anniversary, that when he and Neil had set up the flag and he was saluting the flag, it kind of brought home to him this duality, this strange dichotomy, I guess is a better word, that no two people had ever been farther from home than he and Neil were at that moment. And at the same time, with, you know, a billion people listening or watching on TV, nobody had ever been more in humanity's focus at one moment. So it's things like that. And I could rattle off a whole bunch. Most of them are in my book. As far as what do I want to hear from the astronauts when they come back, I want to hear that stuff. I want to hear about the experience. I want to know, you know, what it feels like to stand amid the shadows of the South Pole and see the Earth not halfway up the sky, but right on the horizon. And the sun, by the way, also, which is going to be a challenge. I'll tell you, one of the things that I think about a lot is, as a part-time space artist and somebody who considers myself, you know, part of that tribe, I want to know what the color of the Earth really looks like. Alan Bean once said to me, the blue of the oceans, and he said to me, darker than you think. And I'm thinking, I know the Earth is supposed to be 40 times brighter than the moon. How do you make a dark blue appear bright? Or maybe it's just the clouds that are bright. Anyway, I'm dying to get information that not only writers can use, because writers will use that. I soaked up every visual detail I could, but artists will use it as well. It's just anything that helps us bridge the gap with that incredible experience would be what I would want to hear. Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, I guess along those lines, in Contact, she says they should have sent a poet. Should we be sending poets?
Well, you know, Al Worden from Apollo 15 actually did come back and write the first lunar poetry. So I would refer you to that. I mean, that shows that you can have at least some of the sensitivity of a poet and still be, you know, somebody who can do a absolutely sterling job on a lunar mission. I would hope that some of the people who get to go will come back and capture some of the poetry of the experience. You know, we'll just have to wait and see. Anybody else?
So I also remember the Apollo 11 landing. We're very close in age, and I reflect back on 2009 when we had that session that we've spoken of at one of the original lunar science forums, and back then we had very few young people that were looking at the moon. That was one of our biggest jobs at then NLSI. Things had changed dramatically, and I'm looking at Sarah. We're smiling and going, "Yeah."
I
And
would say, job well done.
thank you. And I as I look out here, I want to point out 30% of our registrants for this conference were students. 30%. Isn't that amazing? And so, do you have any words for these young people around the audience?
Well, first of all, let me just say that from everything I've heard, you know, you guys, you students, you're so much smarter than I ever had a hope of being. That I'm just amazed by you all. And I have great faith that you will do great things. I guess my advice is do what I was just talking about the astronauts doing. Don't just have your nose in the computer or the phone or the paper that you're writing. Soak it in. Soak up this moment in history that you are now part of, being part of the lunar science community as we take these next steps, and the complexity of the moon that has emerged since Apollo, and we're going to understand that more and more and more. That's one piece of advice. Also, give yourself the freedom to change your mind about your life. You know, when I was a high school student, my ambition was to be an astronaut by way of getting a degree in planetary science. So I went to college to study geology. Fortunately, I was tremendously blessed to be surrounded by professors who were doing planetary geology, and including Jim Head, who had been in the back room, the geology back room during the Apollo EVAs. And you know, I had the opportunity to be a student intern on the Mars landing, the Viking landing at JPL. And you know, it was that experience, as amazing as it was, that made me realize I did not want to do this stuff for a living. I love the subject. I've never lost my passion for planetary geology, but I realized that I had too much right brain creative interest to be happy doing science for a living. So I allowed myself to do something that I never expected I would do. I eventually, almost by accident, got into writing. And that's what led to me standing here today. So, you know, you may find that other passions emerge. And if that happens, don't just stuff them in a corner somewhere. Give them a fair shake, and let your passions guide you to the extent that it's, you know, logistically and economically feasible.
I believe that we have one online question. Ashkan, go ahead, please.
Barbara Cohen says, "Hi, Andy. Thanks for your words about the importance of lunar samples to our understanding of the early Earth-Moon system. What are your thoughts on how much Mars sample return will do the same for terrestrial planets?"
Well, I think it'll be incredible to have pieces of Mars on Earth that we know the context of. We already have pieces of Mars on Earth in the meteorite collection. But I mean, we don't have any Martian soil, and so we don't understand the chemistry of the soil or the toxicity of the soil to the extent that we need to, both for science and for human exploration. Mars, of course, is a much more complex planet than the moon. As much as I love the moon, I don't want to pit them against each other. And I think that, you know, sample science just is where it's at as far as really getting down to understanding another planetary body. So I hope it comes to pass. I hope I'm around to see it and see the results of it. And I think it's, like I say, I think it's going to be amazing. All right.
Looks like that's it. So Andy,
Okay.
thank you so much.